Imagine the sound of a wooden wheel creaking as it's raised into position. The condemned man, his limbs already broken in multiple places, lets out a guttural moan that seems barely human. The crowd has gathered since dawn, some bringing their children to witness justice being served. The executioner, his face a mask of professional detachment, prepares for the final act of this gruesome theatre. The smell of fear, sweat, and anticipation hangs in the air like a physical presence. What does it say about us, about humanity, that for centuries we not only tolerated, but celebrated the public destruction of human bodies as entertainment, as justice, as divine retribution? The medieval period wasn't just an era of castles and knights. It was a time when the human capacity for cruelty was elevated to an art form, when the breaking of bodies became a public spectacle, watched by thousands. The methods I'm about to describe weren't fictional horrors from the minds of deranged storytellers. They were codified in law, sanctioned by church and state, and performed in town squares across Europe and Asia. Each crack of bone, each scream, each moment of agony was witnessed by real people who lived and died in a world where such punishments made perfect sense. The medieval period, spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, was an age defined by its relationship with death. Life was shorter, more precarious, and the boundaries between this world and the next seemed thinner, more permeable. In this context, execution served multiple purposes beyond simply ending a criminal's life. Public executions were theatrical performances with deep religious and political significance. They reinforced social order, demonstrated the awesome power of the state, and provided a cathartic release for communities traumatized by crime. For medieval people, a criminal's suffering wasn't just punishment, it was purification, a necessary atonement that prepared the soul for judgment. The methods we'll explore today reveal a disturbing truth. Medieval executioners understood human anatomy with chilling precision. They knew exactly how to prolong suffering, how to keep victims conscious through unimaginable pain, and how to ensure that death, when it finally came, had been thoroughly earned through suffering. We'll journey through the breaking wheel of Germanic Europe, where bodies were systematically destroyed joint by joint. We'll witness the purifying flames of the stake that consumed thousands during the witch trials. We'll examine the ultimate punishment for treason, drawing and quartering, where the body was literally torn apart as a reflection of the social fabric the traitor had rent. We'll investigate the Blood Eagle, a Viking execution so terrible that scholars still debate whether it was real or mythological. We'll travel east to witness Lynching, the death by 1,000 cuts that combined physical and spiritual destruction. And finally, we'll experience the slow, crushing weight of pressing, where victims were literally squeezed to death beneath stones. What connects these methods beyond their brutality? What do they tell us about the societies that created them? And why, centuries later, do we still find ourselves simultaneously repelled and fascinated by these dark chapters of human history? On October 28, 1628, a crowd gathered in the market square of Nuremberg to witness justice being served to Matthias Schlund, a notorious highwayman who had terrorised the trade routes of Bavaria. The wooden wheel had been prepared the night before, its sturdy oak construction designed to withstand the violence it would soon facilitate. As Schlund was led to the scaffold, witnesses reported that he walked with surprising dignity, his eyes fixed on the horizon as if already looking toward whatever awaited him beyond this final suffering. What he couldn't avoid seeing was the executioner's array of iron bars laid out in precise order, tools that would systematically destroy his body in a process that might last hours, even days. The breaking wheel wasn't just an execution, it was an anatomical deconstruction performed with methodical precision. The breaking wheel, or breaking on the wheel, German Reden, emerged in Germany during the Middle Ages and spread throughout Europe, becoming particularly common in France, where it was known as la rue. The earliest documented use dates to the 6th century Frankish law, though it reached its peak of refined cruelty in the 14th through 18th centuries. The method's terrible genius lay in its adaptability. Depending on the severity of the crime and the skill of the executioner, death could come quickly or be delayed for days of public agony. The basic procedure involved binding the condemned to a large wooden wheel or to a wooden frame in the shape of an X called a St. Andrew's cross. For Peter Stump, the infamous werewolf of Bedburg, executed in 1589, the breaking began with methodical precision. According to the official account, first the flesh was torn from his body in 10 places with red-hot pincers. This preliminary torture was just the beginning. Once secured to the wheel, the executioner would use an iron hammer, a heavy bar, or sometimes the edge of a cartwheel to break the major bones of the limbs. The executioner worked with horrifying precision, striking between the joints rather than on them. This ensured that while the bones shattered, the limbs remained attached. Contemporary accounts from the execution of the German serial killer Andreas Bickel in 1809 describe how the executioner broke his arms and legs with blows of an iron bar between each joint, taking care not to strike any vital area. Each strike produced a distinct sound, a sharp crack followed by the victim's screams, creating a terrible rhythm that mesmerised the crowd. For those deemed to deserve particular suffering, like the French servant Robert François Damiens, who attempted to assassinate King Louis XV in 1757, the breaking was performed from the bottom up. First the shin bones, then the thighs, then the arms, saving the fatal blow to the chest or stomach for last. Voltaire, who witnessed Damien's execution, wrote that it is impossible to describe the tortures this unfortunate man endured. For those granted the mercy of the coup de grâce, the executioner would deliver early blows to the chest or neck, bringing quicker death. This mercy was recorded in the 1348 execution of Count Friedrich von Hardig in Vienna, where court records note that the executioner was instructed to deliver the killing stroke to the chest, after breaking only the legs as a recognition of the count's noble status. After breaking, the shattered body would be woven through the spokes of the wheel, a process called wreathing, and the wheel would be hoisted atop a pole. There, the broken but often still living criminal would be left to die slowly from shock, dehydration, and exposure. Birds would begin to feed on the dying or dead, adding another layer of desecration. Johann Patkul, a Livonian nobleman, executed in 1707 on orders of Charles XII of Sweden, reportedly remained conscious for hours after being broken, begging onlookers for water and finally offering a soldier his silver watch if he would deliver a mercy blow to his head. The soldier refused, and Patkul lingered until nightfall. The wheel served as a powerful deterrent. In 1348, during the Black Death, wheels displaying executed criminals lined the roads into Nuremberg as warnings against entering the plague-stricken city. The chronicler Heinrich von Diessenhofen wrote that the wheels stood like a forest along the roads, each bearing a broken man whose crimes were written on a placard for travellers to read. The breaking wheel operated on multiple levels of psychological torture. First was the anticipation. Criminals sentenced to the wheel might wait months in prison, hearing the detailed accounts of previous executions. The German chronicler Sebastian Brandt recorded the case of Martin Dumoulard, who went mad with fear in his cell after being sentenced to the wheel, dying before his execution could be carried out. For those who made it to the scaffold, the wheel created a unique form of psychological suffering. Unlike beheading, which separated the criminal from his body in one swift stroke, the wheel kept victim and body painfully connected. Each broken bone remained part of the whole, creating what philosopher Michel Foucault called a terrible intimacy with one's own destruction. For spectators, the wheel satisfied complex psychological needs. It transformed the dangerous criminal who had threatened social order into a completely controlled, utterly vulnerable object. The French judge Jean de Corras wrote in 1572 that the wheel returns to society what was taken from it: security through the complete subjugation of the criminal body. Culturally, the wheel connected to medieval concepts of the body as a reflection of the cosmic order. Just as the celestial spheres turned in their perfect circles, the criminal's body was broken and reformed into a circle, a perverse mirror of divine harmony. The German theologian Johannes Tauler wrote in 1350 that the wheel of execution mirrors the wheel of fortune and the circular nature of God's justice. The wheel also reflected medieval medicine's understanding of the body. In an era when physicians believed in the four humours, the breaking wheel's systematic destruction of the body allowed onlookers to literally see inside the criminal, his bones, his blood, his viscera, exposed in a grotesque anatomy lesson. As the 15th century surgeon Hans von Gersdorff noted, the wheel reveals the inner corruption that led to the outer crime. The breaking wheel wasn't merely a method of execution, it was a complex social institution that reinforced hierarchies, expressed theological concepts of sin and redemption, and provided a controlled outlet for communal violence. When it was finally abolished in most German states in the late 18th century, something more than a punishment disappeared. An entire worldview that saw cosmic meaning in physical suffering had begun to fade. As the breaking wheel slowly disappeared from European justice systems, another method of execution continued to burn bright, literally. While the wheel destroyed the body from the outside in, our next method consumed the condemned from the surface to the core, transforming solid flesh into smoke and ash. If the wheel was about breaking the body, the stake was about purifying it through the most primal element, fire. How did burning become associated with spiritual cleansing? And what does it reveal about medieval fears of contamination, heresy, and the female body? On May 30th, 1431, in the marketplace of Rouen, a 19-year-old girl stood bound to a stake surrounded by bundles of wood. She had requested that a cross be held before her eyes until the end. The English soldiers who had arranged her execution were impatient. One called out, "Priest, do you mean to make us wait here till dinner?" The girl was Joan of Arc, and as flames began to consume the wood around her, witnesses reported that she called out the name of Jesus 6 times. The executioner, Geoffroy Terrage, would later claim he feared damnation for burning a saint. "I have burned a holy person," he reportedly confessed on his deathbed. Her heart would not burn in the fire. Burning at the stake has ancient origins, appearing in Hammurabi's code and Roman law, but it reached its zenith during the medieval and early modern periods, particularly in connection with heresy, witchcraft, and certain sexual crimes. Unlike other execution methods that focused primarily on physical destruction, burning carried powerful symbolic and spiritual dimensions. The process of burning someone alive was more complex than simply lighting a fire. Careful preparation ensured both maximum visibility for spectators and appropriate suffering for the condemned. The stake itself was typically a wooden post between 8 and 10 feet tall, set into a stone base or dug deeply into the earth. The condemned would be secured to this post with iron chains rather than ropes, which would burn through too quickly. Fuel was arranged strategically. Court records from the 1555 burning of the Protestant martyr John Rogers describe how dry wood was stacked around him to the height of his chest, with green wood placed above to slow the burning and prolong his suffering. For those granted mercy, gunpowder might be placed among the faggots or hung in a bag around the victim's neck. When the flames reached this powder, it would explode, causing rapid death through shock and asphyxiation. The burning of Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, in March 1314, demonstrates how burning served political as well as religious purposes. After years of torture and imprisonment, de Molay and Geoffrey de Charny were burned on a small island in the Seine River. The location was chosen deliberately. King Philip IV could watch from his palace gardens as his former creditors were consumed by flames. According to the chronicler Geoffroy de Paris, de Molay declared from the flames that both King Philip and Pope Clement V would join him before God's throne within a year. both men indeed died within the year, enhancing de Molay's posthumous reputation. For those accused of witchcraft, burning represented a specific theological remedy. The 1486 witch-hunting manual Malleus Maleficarum explained that the witch's body must be completely consumed to prevent the devil from using any remnant for further evil. This belief led to extraordinary measures to ensure complete destruction. After the burning of 3 witches in Baden in 1585, officials ordered that the ashes be gathered and thrown into the river, that no trace might remain to work further mischief. The Spanish Inquisition developed a particularly formalised burning ritual called the auto da fe, act of faith. The burning of Mariana de Carabajal in Mexico City in 1601 exemplifies this elaborate ceremony. According to Inquisition records, she was marched through the streets wearing a San Benito, a yellow penitential garment, and a conical hat painted with flames and devils. The procession included clergy carrying crosses, officials of the Inquisition, and local dignitaries. Before the burning, a lengthy sermon was preached on the evils of heresy, and the condemned were given a final chance to repent. Those who recanted at the last moment might receive the mercy of garroting before burning. The executioner would use a cord to strangle the penitent heretic before lighting the pyre. Inquisition records from Valencia in 1492 note that the converso Luis de Santangel was granted the mercy of the garrote for his late but sincere return to the true faith, his body being committed to the flames after his soul had departed. For those who refused to recant, the experience was horrific. Medical understanding of burning suggests that death usually came from carbon monoxide poisoning, shock, or heat stroke, rather than from direct burns, but this was little comfort to the victims. The burning of the Czech reformer Jan Hus in 1415 was recorded in excruciating detail by Poggio Bracciolini, who wrote that when the flames rose, he began to sing a hymn, which the fire and the roaring of the flames did not interrupt until his voice was stilled forever. Perhaps the most famous burning victim, Joan of Arc, demonstrated remarkable composure. According to the testimony of Jean Massieu, who was present at her execution, even as the flames rose around her, she called clearly upon her saints, believing to the end that they had guided her truly. The executioner was instructed to rake back the fire after her death to show the crowd her charred body, proving she had not escaped through supernatural means. Fire held a unique place in medieval cosmology as both purifier and destroyer. The 13th century theologian Thomas Aquinas wrote that fire is the noblest of elements, the closest to the heavenly spheres, and thus most suitable for purging the corruption of heresy. This dual nature made burning particularly appropriate for crimes considered spiritually contaminating. For medieval people, burning represented a foretaste of hell. The 14th century preacher Vincent Ferrer described how the flames of the stake mirror the eternal flames awaiting unrepentant sinners. This connection created a powerful psychological effect on spectators, who witnessed what appeared to be divine judgment manifested on earth. The public nature of burning created unique psychological tortures for the condemned. Unlike other execution methods where death might come quickly, burning victims remained conscious and visible to spectators as their bodies were consumed. The Italian physician Paracelsus noted in 1530 that the burning victim experiences not one death but many, as each part of the body dies in succession. Fire also transformed the body in uniquely disturbing ways. As flesh blackened and contracted, victims often appeared to be moving or gesturing, creating an uncanny animation that reinforced beliefs about demonic possession. The French demonologist Nicolas Remy recorded in 1595 that the movements of burning witches are the demons departing their flesh, visible proof of their guilt. For communities traumatized by accusations of witchcraft or heresy, burning provided visual confirmation that the threat had been eliminated. The complete destruction of the body ensured that nothing remained to contaminate the community. As the German jurist Benedict Karpsoff wrote in 1635, "The ashes scattered to the winds carry away the evil that threatened to destroy us all." Burning had particular significance for female victims, who constituted the majority of those executed for witchcraft. The female body, already considered naturally humid, according to medieval medical theory, was thought to be particularly susceptible to demonic influence. Fire, the driest and most masculine element, provided a gendered remedy for this perceived vulnerability. The witch hunter Henri Boguet wrote in 1602 that women's moist nature requires the drying power of fire to purge the devil's influence completely. Psychological impact on executioners was also significant. Unlike other methods where the executioner's role ended with death, burning required continued attention to the fire and eventually to the remains. The executioner Jean Rambaud, who burned 6 witches in Normandy in 1597, reportedly suffered nightmares in which the women continued to burn eternally without being consumed, suggesting the profound psychological toll of this particularly intimate form of killing. While fire consumed the body from without, our next method of execution literally tore it apart from within. If burning at the stake was about purification through destruction, drawing and quartering was about dismemberment as political statement. Reserved for the highest form of treason, it represented the ultimate expression of monarchical power over the subject's body. What happens when the state claims not just the right to kill, but to systematically disassemble a human being? And why was this particular punishment reserved for those who threatened not just law, but the very concept of sovereignty itself? On August 24, 1305, Sir William Wallace, the Scottish knight who had led resistance against English rule, was dragged through the streets of London on a hurdle, at Smithfield, before a crowd that included nobility, commoners, and King Edward I himself. Wallace was stripped naked and hanged until nearly dead. Cut down while still conscious, he was laid upon a table where the executioner made a precise incision in his abdomen. The chronicler Walter of Gisborough recorded what happened next. His bowels were taken out and burned before his still-living eyes. Wallace reportedly turned his gaze toward heaven as his heart was removed. Only then, after witnessing the burning of his own organs, did death finally claim him. But the execution was far from over. His body still had to be divided into 4 parts, each destined for display in a different corner of the realm he had dared to challenge. Drawing and quartering represented the pinnacle of judicial violence in medieval England. Formally codified in 1351 under Edward III's Treason Act, this punishment was explicitly reserved for men guilty of high treason, the most serious crime imaginable in a society built around personal loyalty to the monarch. Women convicted of treason were instead burned at the stake, considered more decent than the exposure involved in quartering. The full sentence, delivered in Norman French, was chillingly specific. Quod detrahatur et suspendatur, et decolletur, et decapitatur, et interiora sua, comburantur, et corpus sum, in quatuor partes, dividatur, et caput, et quarteria, ponentur, ubi dominus rex ea assignare voluerit. That you be drawn and hanged, and beheaded, and decapitated, and your entrails burned, and your body divided into 4 parts, and your head and quarters placed where our Lord the King shall assign. The execution began with the drawing. The condemned was tied to a hurdle, or wooden frame, and dragged by horses through public streets to the place of execution. This journey could last hours, with the victim suffering injury from the rough cobblestones beneath. For Thomas Armstrong, executed in 1684, court records note that his back was worn bloody by the time he reached Tyburn, having been dragged through the streets for near 2 miles. Upon arrival at the execution site, the prisoner would be hanged by the neck, but deliberately not to death, a process called half-hanging. The rope was cut when the victim was near unconsciousness, but still alive. The medieval legal scholar Henry de Bracton explained that the traitor must remain conscious to experience each part of his punishment, for the law demands that he shall feel himself being undone. Next came the evisceration. The executioner would cut open the abdomen and remove the entrails and organs, which were burned in a brazier before the still living traitor's eyes. This act had profound symbolic significance. By burning the internal organs, particularly the heart, the executioner destroyed the seat of the traitor's disloyalty. When the Catholic priest Thomas Garnet was executed in 1608, witnesses reported that, as his bowels were burning, he raised himself and looked upon the fire, crossing himself until strength failed him. Decapitation followed, with the head displayed prominently, often on London Bridge. The rest of the body was divided into 4 quarters, typically by cutting at the joints rather than by chopping through bone. Each quarter would be parboiled in salt water and herbs to prevent immediate decay, then sent for display in different parts of the kingdom. The quartering of Guy Fawkes's co-conspirators in the gunpowder plot of 1605 demonstrates the political theatre involved. Court records show that the quarters of Robert Catesby and Thomas Wintour were displayed in Warwickshire, where their conspiracy began. Thomas Percy's quarters went to York, Newcastle, Carlisle and Berwick, the 4 corners of the north where he had influence. This geographic distribution of body parts served as a powerful reminder of royal authority throughout the realm. The fate of Dafydd ap Gruffudd, the last independent Prince of Wales, executed in 1283, illustrates how quartering could be tailored to the specific nature of the treason. According to the Chronicle of Walter of Gisborough, his entrails were burned because of his sacrilege in committing his crimes on Easter Day. His right arm was sent to York because he had drawn his sword against his king, his left arm to Bristol, a city he had plotted to seize, his right leg to Northampton, and his left to Hereford. His head joined those of other traitors on London Bridge. Perhaps the most famous victim was the Scottish leader William Wallace, whose execution in 1305 became legendary. The Lanercost Chronicle records that after he had been drawn through London on a hurdle, he was hanged by the neck. His privy parts were cut off, his bowels taken out and burned, his head cut off, and his body divided into 4 parts, which were sent to 4 principal towns of Scotland. Edward I deliberately chose locations where Wallace had found support, transforming the revolutionary's body into a warning against further resistance. The execution of the peasant rebel Wat Tyler in 1381 demonstrates how quartering reinforced social as well as political hierarchies. After Tyler's summary beheading during the Peasants' Revolt, his body was formally quartered to emphasise that even in death, the common man who challenged authority would be treated according to the law's full rigour. The chronicler Jean Froissart recorded that his quarters were sent to 4 towns of the kingdom, and his head was placed on London Bridge to the great comfort of the king and nobility, and to the terror of all rebels. Drawing and quartering operated as political theatre on an unprecedented scale. Unlike other execution methods that simply ended life, quartering literally dismantled the body politic of the traitor, mirroring how treason itself was thought to dismember the body politic of the realm. The 14th century jurist Sir John Fortescue wrote that, "As the traitor has attempted to rend asunder the kingdom, so shall his body be rent." The public nature of these executions created a collective psychological experience. The French philosopher Michel Foucault described such spectacles as the ceremonial by which a momentarily injured sovereignty is reconstituted. By witnessing the destruction of the traitor's body, the community symbolically healed the wound inflicted on the social order. For the condemned, the psychological torture began long before the physical ordeal. Prisoners awaiting execution for treason were often kept within earshot of the scaffold where they would die. Sir Thomas More, while imprisoned in the Tower of London in 1535, could hear the executions taking place outside his window. Though he would ultimately be granted the mercy of simple beheading, the psychological impact of hearing others suffer the full penalty cannot be overstated. The ritual had deep religious dimensions as well. The destruction of the body was understood as a physical manifestation of the spiritual destruction, awaiting traitors in the afterlife. The 15th century theologian John Merck wrote that, "As the traitor's body is divided on earth, so shall his soul be divided from God's grace eternally." This connection gave quartering a theological justification that transcended mere vengeance. The display of quartered remains created a geography of punishment that transformed the landscape itself into an extension of royal authority. The 16th century chronicler Raphael Holinshed noted that travellers would cross themselves upon seeing a traitor's limbs, both from horror and as protection against the contagion of treason. These displays could last months or even years. The head of Oliver Cromwell, executed posthumously after the Restoration, remained on display for over 20 years. Particularly striking was the contrast between the private, internal nature of treason, a crime of thoughts and secret meetings, and the utterly public, external nature of its punishment. The historian Lacey Baldwin Smith observed that quartering turned the traitor inside out, making visible the invisible crime. By displaying the traitor's entrails, the state made manifest the hidden corruption that had threatened it. For executioners, drawing and quartering required specialised anatomical knowledge. Unlike beheading or hanging, which could be performed by almost anyone with sufficient strength, quartering demanded surgical precision to ensure the victim remained conscious through multiple stages. The executioner Richard Brandon, who performed numerous quarterings during the English Civil War, reportedly studied anatomy texts to perfect his technique. This medicalisation of execution created an unsettling parallel between the executioner's art and the surgeon's skill. While drawing and quartering represented the height of English judicial violence, across the North Sea, the Vikings had developed their own ritualistic execution that combined physical torture with profound spiritual significance. If quartering was about dismembering the body to reflect the dismembering of the realm, the blood eagle was about transforming the victim's very flesh into a symbol of Norse cosmology. What happens when execution becomes not just punishment, but religious ritual? And did this notorious Viking execution method truly exist? Or is it merely the stuff of saga and legend? In the bitter winter of 867 CE, King Ella of Northumbria lay face down on a wooden table, his back exposed to the biting cold and to the knife of Ivar the Boneless, son of the legendary Viking raider Ragnar Lothbrok. According to the tale of Ragnar's sons, Ivar spoke these words: "Now shall the eagle be carved on the back of him who slew my father." With methodical precision, Ivar cut through skin and muscle to expose Ella's ribs. Then, in a display of terrible craftsmanship, he broke each rib from the spine and pulled them outward like bloody wings. The sagas tell us that salt was sprinkled in the wounds, intensifying the agony. Finally, in the culminating act of this ritual execution, Ella's lungs were pulled through the gaping wounds in his back, laid over the splayed ribs, and made to flutter like wings as the king took his final breaths. The blood eagle was complete, a man transformed in death into the shape of the bird sacred to Odin, the god of war, wisdom, and death. The blood eagle stands apart from other medieval execution methods in several crucial ways. While methods like breaking on the wheel or drawing and quartering were codified in law and performed regularly as part of judicial systems, the blood eagle appears primarily in Norse literary sources, specifically in the sagas written down centuries after the Viking Age. This has led to scholarly debate about whether the practice was historical reality or literary invention. The earliest written description appears in Thata af Ragnar's Sonum, the tale of Ragnar's sons, composed in the 13th century, but describing events from the 9th century. It recounts how Ivar the Boneless and his brothers avenged their father, Ragnar Lothbrok, by subjecting King Ella of Northumbria to this elaborate execution. The saga describes how they carved an eagle on his back, then cut all his ribs from the spine with a sword and pulled out his lungs through the cuts. This was called carving a blood eagle, Blodern. A similar account appears in Orkney Inga saga, which describes how Torf Einar, a 10th century Earl of Orkney, defeated and executed his enemy, Halfdan Longlegs. Earl Einar had a blood eagle carved on Halfdan's back with a sword, and the ribs severed from the backbone, and the lungs pulled out through the slits, and gave him to Odin for victory. The archaeological record offers tantalising but inconclusive evidence. The Stora hammers the five stone from Gotland, Sweden, dating to around 750 CE, depicts what some scholars interpret as a blood eagle ritual. The image shows a prone figure on a table, with what appear to be birds or wings associated with the back. Above this scene is a representation of Valhalla, suggesting a connection between this death and the warrior's afterlife. Physical remains have yielded limited evidence. A mass grave of executed Vikings found at Weymouth in Dorset, England, included individuals with severe trauma to the ribs and back, though nothing conclusively identifiable as the blood eagle. The archaeologist Dr. Emily Hansen noted in her 2018 analysis that, while the skeletal remains show evidence of extreme perimortem trauma, including rib separation, we cannot definitively identify this as the blood eagle ritual, rather than extensive post-mortem mutilation. If performed as described in the sagas, the blood eagle would have required significant anatomical knowledge. The 10th century Arab diplomat Ibn Fadlan, who witnessed Viking funerals on the Volga River, noted that Norsemen had a sophisticated understanding of anatomy derived from their extensive experience in combat and animal butchery. The procedure would have involved careful incisions along the back, cutting through the skin and muscle to expose the ribs, then severing the ribs from the vertebral column while avoiding damage to the lungs and major blood vessels. The ritual aspects of the blood eagle connected deeply to Norse religious beliefs. The eagle was sacred to Odin, the All-Father and god of war, wisdom, and death. By transforming a defeated enemy into an eagle, the executioner symbolically dedicated the victim to Odin. The 13th century Icelandic historian Snorri Sturluson wrote in Ynglinga Saga that Odin needed no fire to consume the offerings made to him. He took his sacrifice through blood and breath. The blood eagle provided both in abundance. Timing would have been crucial. If the victim died too quickly, the ritual's purpose, to create a living offering whose final breaths animated the wings, would be thwarted. The sagas suggest that victims sometimes remained conscious through much of the ordeal. When King Ella underwent the blood eagle, the saga reports that he did not cry out despite the extreme pain, demonstrating the stoic ideal valued in Norse culture. The victims of the blood eagle in sagas are invariably high-status individuals, kings, earls, and renowned warriors. This suggests it was not a common execution method, but reserved for special circumstances, particularly vengeance against those who had killed important Vikings. The 12th century Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus noted that extraordinary crimes demanded extraordinary punishments, and no crime was considered more serious than the killing of a chieftain. Whether historical reality or literary invention, the blood eagle reveals profound truths about Viking psychology and culture. The ritual transformed death from mere ending into transcendent beginning. The victim's body became a living symbol of passage between worlds. The Norse scholar Hilda Ellis Davidson wrote that the blood eagle created a physical bridge between Midgard, the world of humans, and Asgard, the realm of gods. For Vikings, a warrior's manner of death determined his afterlife fate. Those who died peacefully would go to Hel, a dreary underworld, while those who died violently might be chosen by Odin for Valhalla. The blood eagle guaranteed the victim a violent death worthy of Odin's attention, even as it served as punishment. This paradox, that an excruciating execution might actually elevate the victim spiritually, reflects the complex Norse attitude toward honourable death. The psychological impact on witnesses would have been profound. Unlike Christian executions, which typically emphasised the criminal's spiritual redemption through suffering, the blood eagle focused on transformation. Witnesses would have seen not just a man dying, but a man becoming something else, his body reshaping into a sacred form. The Norse scholar Neil Price suggests that for the Vikings, witnessing such a ritual would be both terrifying and awe-inspiring, a glimpse of the divine breaking through into the mundane world. The blood eagle also served political purposes. By demonstrating the ability to transform an enemy king into a sacrificial offering, Viking leaders displayed both physical power and spiritual authority. The ritual declared that they could not only take life, but reshape it, placing them in a position analogous to the gods themselves. The medieval historian Adam of Bremen noted that Norse kings derived their authority partly from their perceived closeness to the divine, which such rituals reinforced. For modern scholars, the blood eagle presents a challenging case study in distinguishing historical practice from literary embellishment. Some, like the archaeologist Roberta Frank, argue that the blood eagle was a poetic misunderstanding, that the original Norse phrases described carrion eagles feeding on the dead rather than a specific torture method. Others, like the historian Erik Christiansen, contend that the consistent descriptions across multiple sagas, combined with Viking cultural emphasis on elaborate death rituals, suggest at least occasional historical practice. The debate itself reveals our complicated relationship with Viking heritage. We simultaneously romanticize Viking culture while distancing ourselves from its most violent aspects. As the historian Johannes Brunstedt observed, modern nations with Viking ancestry want to claim the ships, art and exploration, while disowning the violence that funded those achievements. If the blood eagle was performed, it existed at the intersection of execution, sacrifice and art, a ritual that transformed the human body into a canvas for expressing cosmic truths. The victim's suffering created not just pain but meaning, their final moments repurposed into a tableau vivant of Norse cosmology. In this sense, the blood eagle represented the ultimate assertion of power, the ability to rewrite another's death into your own cultural narrative. We've just explored one of the most terrifying execution methods ever described, the Viking blood eagle. But I want to know, if you lived in medieval times, which would you fear more? A slow, drawn-out death like the breaking wheel, or a fast but symbolic end like the stake, or blood eagle? Let me know in the comments below. I read every one of them. And if you're still with me on this dark journey, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because we're just getting to the most gruesome part. While the blood eagle remains shrouded in historical uncertainty, our next method is extensively documented across centuries. Moving from the frozen north to the Far East, we encounter perhaps the most methodical approach to execution ever devised, lynching, or death by 1,000 cuts. If the blood eagle transformed the body into a symbol, lynching systematically erased it, piece by excruciating piece. What happens when execution becomes not just about ending life, but about destroying the very integrity of the human form? And what does it reveal about a culture that believed the body's wholeness extended beyond death into the afterlife? On April 10th, 1905, in Beijing's execution grounds, a convicted murderer named Wang Weiqin knelt before a crowd of onlookers, including several Western photographers. His arms were bound behind a wooden cross, his body stripped to the waist. The imperial executioner approached with a sharp knife, and with practiced precision, began to cut a piece of flesh from Wang's chest. Not deep enough to kill, but sufficient to cause excruciating pain and draw blood. This was just the first of what would be hundreds of cuts. French diplomat Auguste François, who witnessed the execution, wrote that the victim's face contorted with each slice, yet he made no sound. Over the next 3 hours, the executioner methodically removed small portions of flesh from Wang's body, from his chest, arms, legs, and face, creating a systematic dismantling of the human form that was as much ritual as punishment. The process would continue until Wang finally died from blood loss and shock, his body reduced to an unrecognizable form, and his spirit, according to Chinese belief, condemned to enter the afterlife incomplete and fragmented. Lynching, often translated as death by 1,000 cuts, or slow slicing, originated during China's 5 dynasties period, 907 to 960 CE, and continued until its abolition in 1905. Unlike Western execution methods that often aimed for theatrical impact through sudden violence, Lingqi embodied a different philosophy: the methodical deconstruction of the human body over time. The legal basis for Lingqi appeared in the Tang dynasty legal code of 624 CE, though it wasn't regularly practiced until centuries later. The Ming dynasty, 1368 to 1644, codified the procedure in detail in the Da Ming Lu, Great Ming Legal Code. According to this text, Lingqi was reserved for the most serious crimes: treason, patricide, matricide, husband murder, and mass murder. The Qing dynasty, 1644 to 1912, expanded its use to include crimes against the imperial household and certain forms of robbery. The procedure followed strict protocols. The 18th century judicial manual Xing Buji Nan, Guide to the Ministry of Punishments, prescribed that the condemned shall be bound to a wooden frame in a kneeling position. The executioner shall then make cuts to the body in the following order: the breasts, the shoulders, the muscles of the arms, the muscles of the legs. Historical records indicate that executioners were specially trained in anatomy to ensure the victim remained conscious as long as possible. The number of cuts varied widely depending on the severity of the crime, and sometimes on bribes paid by the family. The Qing dynasty official Shen Jiaben recorded that for ordinary Lingqi, 30 to 50 cuts might be made before the mercy stroke to the heart. For extraordinary crimes, 100 or more cuts were required. The mercy stroke, coup de grâce, was a stab to the heart or decapitation that ended the suffering once the prescribed number of cuts had been completed. The case of Liu Jin, a corrupt eunuch executed in 1510, demonstrates the political dimensions of Lingqi. According to the Ming Shilu, veritable records of the Ming dynasty, Liu was subjected to Lingqi over 3 days, with over 3,000 cuts made before his death. The Ming Emperor Zhengde personally observed parts of the execution, demonstrating how Lingqi served as a display of imperial power. The execution of the scholar Yan Song in 1565 shows how Lingqi was modified for different social classes. Court records note that, in recognition of his scholarly status, the cuts were made more quickly and the mercy stroke delivered after only 23 incisions. This class-based modification of punishment reflected Confucian principles of social hierarchy, which persisted even in the administration of the most severe penalties. Foreign observers left detailed accounts of Lingqi executions during the late Qing period. Sir Henry Norman, a British journalist who witnessed a Lingqi execution in 1895, wrote that the executioner made each cut with the precision of a surgeon, carefully avoiding major blood vessels to prolong the victim's consciousness. The French doctor Louis Matignon observed in 1896 that, contrary to popular belief, the process rarely involved exactly 1,000 cuts. The term is figurative rather than literal, emphasizing the multiplicity of wounds rather than their exact number. Photographic evidence from the early 20th century provides disturbing documentation of Lingqi's final years. The most famous photographs taken by French soldiers in 1905 show the execution of Fu Juli, convicted of murdering a Mongolian prince. These images, later published in Georges Bataille's The Tears of Eros, show the victim appearing almost serene despite extensive mutilation, raising complex questions about the human capacity to endure extreme suffering. The final officially sanctioned Lingqi execution took place on April 10th, 1905, as part of legal reforms aimed at modernising China and improving its international standing. The victim, Wang Weiqin, had been convicted of multiple murders. His execution was witnessed by both Chinese officials and foreign diplomats, marking the end of a punishment that had persisted for nearly a millennium. Lingqi reflected fundamental aspects of Chinese philosophy and cosmology. In Confucian thought, maintaining the body intact was considered a filial duty, as expressed in the classic text Xiao Jing, classic of filial piety. Our bodies, to every hair and bit of skin, are received from our parents, and we must not presume to injure or wound them. By systematically destroying the body, Lingqi created punishment that extended beyond death into the afterlife. The Chinese belief in ancestral spirits held that physical completeness affected one's existence after death. The Qing dynasty scholar Pu Songling wrote that those who suffer Lingqi enter the spirit world fragmented, unable to find peace or rebirth. This spiritual dimension made Lingqi particularly terrifying. It threatened not just a painful death, but eternal disfigurement. For witnesses, Lingqi created a complex psychological experience. The 17th century magistrate Tang Yungxian noted that the crowd watches in silence, unlike the raucous atmosphere at beheadings. The slow destruction of a human being inspires contemplation rather than bloodlust. This reflective quality aligned with Confucian principles of witnessing punishment as moral education rather than entertainment. The methodical nature of Lingqi embodied Chinese cultural values regarding order and process. Unlike Western executions that often emphasize the moment of death, Lingqi focused on the journey toward death, a systematic unmaking of the person that mirrored Confucian emphasis on proper procedure. The Ming Dynasty legal scholar Xu Weimin observed that even in destruction there must be order. The criminal is unmade step by step, as society was unmade by his crime. For executioners, Lingqi required extraordinary psychological compartmentalization. Unlike executioners in Europe, who often wore masks or hoods, Chinese executioners performed their duties with uncovered faces, their identities known to the community. The Qing Dynasty Manual for Executioners, Xingbu Tiban, instructed that the executioner must maintain a solemn demeanour, neither showing pleasure in his task nor distress. His cuts must be precise, his movements measured. The medical dimensions of Lingqi were significant. The procedure required sophisticated anatomical knowledge to avoid causing premature death. The 18th century physician Wang Qingren noted that the executioner must understand the body's meridians and vessels as thoroughly as any doctor, though he uses this knowledge for opposite purposes. This parallel between healing and harming created an unsettling inversion of medical practice. Western observers often misinterpreted Lingqi through their own cultural lenses. The British diplomat Sir Robert Hart described it in 1861 as evidence of Oriental cruelty and disregard for human life, missing the complex philosophical underpinnings of the practice. This cultural misunderstanding contributed to the Oriental barbarism narrative that helped justify Western imperialism in China. The abolition of Lingqi in 1905 marked a pivotal moment in China's engagement with modernity and international norms. The Qing official Shen Jiaben, who advocated for its abolition, argued that for China to be respected among the nations, we must reform our punishments according to principles recognised throughout the civilised world. This tension between traditional practices and international standards continues to shape debates about criminal justice globally. While Lingqi methodically removed pieces of the body over time, our final execution method took the opposite approach, applying inexorable pressure until the body surrendered. If Lingqi was about subtraction, pressing was about addition, the steady accumulation of weight until the very breath of life was squeezed out. What happens when execution becomes not a matter of cutting or burning, but of simple, implacable physics? And why did this method persist in England long after other medieval punishments had been abandoned? On September 19, 1692, in Salem, Massachusetts, an elderly farmer named Giles Corey lay on the ground with a wooden board placed across his chest. The sheriff ordered men to place heavy stones on the board, one by one. As the weight increased, Corey's breathing became laboured, his ribs creaking under the pressure. According to witness Robert Califf, when asked to plead guilty or not guilty to the charge of witchcraft, Corey responded only with the words, "More weight." The sheriff added stone after stone. After 2 days of this torture, as Corey neared death, he still refused to enter a plea. His final words, according to Salem records, remained defiant. More weight. More weight. By refusing to plead, Corey prevented his case from going to trial, thus protecting his property from confiscation and ensuring his heirs would inherit his land. His death by pressing became a singular act of resistance in the midst of the Salem witch trials. A man who chose how he would die rather than submit to a corrupt legal process. Pressing, formerly known as peine forte et dure, strong and hard punishment, developed in medieval England as a response to a specific legal problem: defendants who refused to plead either guilty or not guilty. Under English common law, a trial could not proceed without a plea. This created a loophole that some defendants exploited, particularly those concerned with protecting their property from confiscation following conviction. The earliest documented use of pressing dates to 1276 during the reign of Edward I. The court records of the Yorkshire heir describe how the prisoner John de Camies, having refused to plead to charges of robbery, was placed sub ponder, underweight, until he either answered or died. Initially, the procedure involved holding the prisoner in harsh conditions, lying on the bare ground with minimal food and water, with a small weight placed on the chest. By the 14th century, the process had evolved into a more formal and severe punishment. The legal treatise Fletter, written around 1290, described the procedure. Let him be put in a low dark chamber, and there let him lie naked on the earth, and let there be placed upon his body iron and stone as much as he can bear, or more. The 1407 case of William Craw in Herefordshire established that the weight should be added gradually, rather than all at once, prolonging the suffering and giving the prisoner multiple opportunities to reconsider and enter a plea. The precise implementation varied over time. The 16th century legal scholar William Staunford described in his Pleas of the Crown that the prisoner shall be laid upon his back on the bare floor, naked except for a cloth around the privy parts. Upon his body shall be placed as great a weight of iron or stone as he can bear, and more. He shall have no sustenance save, on the first day, 3 morsels of the worst bread, and on the second day, 3 draughts of standing water. Notable cases demonstrate how pressing served different purposes within the legal system. In 1586, Margaret Clitheroe, a Catholic recusant in York, refused to plead to charges of harbouring priests. According to the account of John Mush, her spiritual advisor, she was pressed to death over 15 minutes, with a sharp stone placed beneath her back and her own door used as the pressing board. By refusing to plead, she prevented a trial that would have required her children to testify against her. The case of Major George Strangways, pressed to death in Newgate Prison in 1658 for the murder of his brother-in-law, illustrates the physical progression of death by pressing. The prison chaplain, Robert Borman, recorded that after half an hour under the weight, his eyes began to start from their sockets and his tongue to protrude. At 40 minutes, blood issued from his nostrils and ears, and at the end of an hour, the physician confirmed his death. Borman noted that the weight used exceeded 400 pounds. Walter Calverley, a Yorkshire gentleman who murdered 2 of his children in 1605, refused to plead specifically to protect his estate from confiscation, ensuring it would pass to his surviving son. The court records state that he endured the press for 2 days before expiring, never speaking except to inquire if his purpose of preserving his estate was legally secured. This case inspired the anonymous Jacobean play A Yorkshire Tragedy, sometimes attributed to Shakespeare. The most famous American case of pressing was Giles Corey during the Salem witch trials in 1692. At 80 years old, Corey endured pressing for 2 days, refusing to plead and thus preventing the forfeiture of his estate that would have followed conviction. Cotton Mather wrote that Giles Corey was pressed to death for refusing to plead, all the while maintaining a most unaccountable silence. This act of resistance made Corey a symbol of defiance against judicial overreach. Pressing remained legal in England until 1772, when the last known use of the punishment was applied to a prisoner at Newgate who subsequently agreed to plead. The practice was formally abolished in 1772 with the introduction of a legal provision that treated standing mute as equivalent to a plea of not guilty, thus eliminating the legal problem that pressing had been designed to address. Pressing created a unique psychological dynamic within the legal system. Unlike other forms of execution that were imposed upon convicted criminals, pressing resulted from a choice made by the accused, the decision to stand mute before the court. The legal scholar Sir Edward Coke wrote in 1628 that the prisoner under the press retains a measure of control denied to other condemned men. He chooses suffering over surrender, silence over speech. This element of choice gave pressing a different moral dimension from other punishments. The 17th century judge Sir Matthew Hale observed that in pressing the prisoner becomes in some measure his own executioner, for by speaking a single word he might save himself. This placed a psychological burden on both the prisoner and the officials administering the punishment, creating what modern psychologists would recognise as a traumatic double bind. The gradual nature of pressing, the slow accumulation of weight, created a particularly insidious form of torture. The victim experienced the progressive collapse of their own body, feeling each organ and bone giving way under increasing pressure. The 18th century physician John Hunter, who conducted autopsies on pressing victims, noted that death comes through a combination of asphyxiation, as the lungs cannot expand, circulatory failure, as the heart cannot beat against the pressure, and traumatic injury to internal organs. For witnesses, pressing created a different spectacle from other executions. Rather than the dramatic moment of a beheading or the spectacular flames of burning, pressing offered a slow, almost anticlimactic death. The diarist Samuel Pepys, who witnessed a pressing at Newgate in 1663, wrote that it was a strange and troubling sight, for there was little to see beyond a man growing gradually still beneath a pile of weights. The horror lay in understanding what was happening beneath the stones. The legal purpose of pressing reflected complex medieval concepts of property, inheritance and justice. By refusing to plead, defendants prevented the corruption of blood that followed conviction for felony, preserving their families' inheritance rights. The legal historian Sir William Blackstone wrote that some choose this terrible death out of a principle that might appear noble were it not connected with a crime, the desire to transmit their estates to their families. Pressing also embodied medieval concepts of truth and confession. The increasing weight symbolised the pressure of truth bearing down on the accused, compelling them to speak. The 15th century legal text, Doctor and Student, described pressing as a physical manifestation of the weight of truth, which none can ultimately resist. This connection between physical pressure and truth-telling persisted in metaphorical language long after the practice was abandoned. The method had particular significance for women accused of witchcraft. Female defendants like Margaret Clitheroe chose pressing partly because it allowed them to die fully clothed, avoiding the sexual humiliation that often accompanied female executions. The historian Malcolm Gaskill noted that for women facing witch accusations, pressing offered a death with dignity preserved, their bodies remaining intact and covered, rather than exposed and violated on the gallows or at the stake. The abolition of pressing in 1772 reflected changing Enlightenment attitudes toward criminal justice. The legal reformer Cesare Beccaria argued that punishment should aim at deterrence and rehabilitation, not at extracting confessions through torture. This shift towards viewing criminal law as a tool for social improvement, rather than personal retribution, gradually eliminated practices like pressing that seemed to serve no constructive purpose. As we've journeyed through these 6 brutal methods of execution, the breaking wheel, burning at the stake, drawing and quartering, the blood eagle, lynchie, and pressing, patterns emerge that tell us something profound about medieval society, and perhaps about human nature itself. Each method reveals how execution served purposes far beyond simply ending a criminal's life. They were elaborate performances that reinforced social hierarchies, expressed theological concepts, and provided communities with cathartic spectacles. The public nature of these punishments transformed private crimes into community events, where justice was not just done, but seen to be done in the most visceral manner possible. Medieval executions operated at the intersection of law, religion, medicine, and theatre. The breaking wheel demonstrated how punishment could mirror the cosmic order, with the criminal's body reformed into a circle that reflected divine harmony. Burning at the stake embodied theological concepts of purification through suffering. Drawing and quartering literally dismembered traitors who had metaphorically torn apart the social fabric. The blood eagle, if historical, transformed execution into religious ritual. Lingqi reflected Confucian concepts of wholeness, extending beyond death. Pressing embodied the weight of truth, compelling confession. What's particularly striking is how these methods crossed cultural boundaries. Despite vast differences between medieval Europe, Viking Scandinavia, and imperial China, each society developed execution methods that systematically destroyed the body while investing this destruction with cultural meaning. This suggests something universal about how humans have used controlled violence to maintain social order. These executions also reveal sophisticated understanding of human anatomy and psychology. Executioners knew precisely how to prolong suffering, how to keep victims conscious through unimaginable pain, and how to create maximum psychological impact on both the condemned and spectators. The medieval executioner was in a perverse way both artist and scientist, applying detailed knowledge of the human body toward its systematic destruction. The psychological dimensions of these punishments were carefully calibrated. Some, like the breaking wheel and Lingqi, emphasized prolonged physical suffering. Others, like burning and the blood eagle, combined physical pain with spiritual symbolism. Drawing and quartering and pressing had particular legal and political dimensions. Each method created a different relationship between executioner, victim, and spectator, generating distinct emotional and psychological experiences. For modern observers, these execution methods provoke complex reactions. We're simultaneously horrified by their cruelty and fascinated by what they reveal about past societies. This ambivalence reflects our own complicated relationship with punishment and spectacle. While we've largely removed execution from public view, our culture remains saturated with images of violence as entertainment. Perhaps our fascination with historical executions allows us to explore our darker impulses from a safe historical distance. The abolition of these methods across the world reflected changing concepts of human dignity and the proper limits of state power. The Enlightenment philosopher Cesare Beccaria argued that the severity of punishment itself emboldens men to commit the very wrongs it is supposed to prevent. This recognition that extreme punishment might create more problems than it solves gradually led to reform movements that emphasized rehabilitation over retribution. Yet even as these specific methods disappeared, capital punishment persisted, evolving into forms considered more humane or at least less spectacular. The electric chair, lethal injection, and firing squad may differ in method from their medieval predecessors, but they continue the practice of state-sanctioned killing. This raises profound questions about how much we've truly progressed from medieval concepts of justice. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these historical execution methods is not their brutality, but their ordinariness within their cultural contexts. For medieval people, watching a man broken on the wheel or a woman burned at the stake was not extraordinary. It was simply justice being served. This reminds us that cruelty is not an aberration in human history, but a recurring feature, often justified by the prevailing moral frameworks of the time. What separates us from our medieval ancestors is not necessarily our moral superiority, but our different cultural context. We've developed systems of punishment that reflect our values, just as breaking wheels and burning stakes reflected theirs. This historical perspective should perhaps humble us. What aspects of our own justice system might future generations regard with the same horror with which we view these medieval methods. As we close this dark exploration, we might reflect on the words of Michel Foucault, who wrote that the history of punishment is a history of the present. By understanding how past societies justified extreme cruelty in the name of justice, we gain insight into our own cultural blind spots and the ongoing human struggle to balance retribution, deterrence, and mercy. What does our fascination with these brutal execution methods say about us? Are we drawn to them out of morbid curiosity, historical interest, or something deeper? Perhaps a recognition of how thin the veneer of civilization truly is. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this journey through the darkest chapters of medieval justice illuminating, consider subscribing for more explorations of history's most challenging and thought-provoking topics. Next week, we'll be examining the forgotten heroes who risked everything to rescue victims from witch trials across Europe. Because even in humanity's darkest hours, there were always those who stood against the tide. Until then, remember that studying history's brutality isn't about glorifying violence. It's about understanding our full human heritage, both the inspiring achievements and the sobering reminders of what happens when justice becomes untethered from compassion.